Hey YouTube, welcome back to the RPG Daily. I'm your host Richard Quiner, and we are with the Game Master's Craft. Today we have a really special guest. This is Dan Masucci from inkdmage on Instagram. He does some of the most amazing terrain builds I've ever seen, and like myself, he likes seafaring kind of things. I've seen him do a lot of stuff at the docks, which I gotta appreciate that. So we are gonna get into that here in just a moment. Dan, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time in this crazy world we're in to sit down and talk D&D. Before we dive in and at me asking you all these questions, can you tell the audience who you are and what is it that you do?
Hey, thanks very much for having me and for the viewers who are checking this out. My name is Dan Masucci, and I am Inked Mage on Instagram, the Dungeon Master your mother warned you about. I live in upstate New York, although there is some debate about what upstate is. I'm about 3 hours north of New York City and probably about 3 hours south of Canada on the eastern side of the state.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's very specific of
Yeah,
upstate. I've never known what upstate actually counted as
yeah.
because I've
Well,
only ever been to New
people
York City.
Well, and that's it. Usually, when people meet you and they're like, "Oh, you're from New York," I'm like, "Well, that's a very intimidating city." And I'm like, "Oh, it certainly is a nice place to visit." However, I'm I'm about 3 hours north. It's a massive state, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Very cool. And so what is your main content kind of that you create on Instagram?
Well, I began my Instagram. I don't even know how long ago, but I had another Instagram account, and I was like, you know what? I didn't want to fill that Instagram account with nerdy stuff, and I've long since forgot the password to that other one. And I have a regular Friday night Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Been gaming with the same crew for over 10 years. Some of my players, I have gamed with really far back, including my brother, who turned me onto the game in 1987, and so I just started sharing like pictures of what I was doing at the table, with the setup, and in the beginning it was very limited to like maps and tiles and stuff like that, and then slowly as I was venturing into the obsession of Dungeons and Dragons miniatures and terrain, it became more elaborate, and people started tuning in, and I was like, okay, I that's cool. Maybe I can inspire some people in terms of like being creative, because I'm not I don't have an unlimited amount of wealth for this stuff, so I like to really maximize the versatility of what it is that I have and use it again and again in interesting ways, and maybe so other people can see what the possibilities are for them.
Yeah, because honestly, when I look at your setups and your builds, it looks like you have about 3 truckfuls of terrain that you can pull from. But I'm assuming that's not the case
It,
because you're a normal person.
yeah, no, it increased. I mean, I've been collect. I I began playing Dungeons and Dragons in '87, and somewhere in the like mid '90s, got married. Started having kids, and so took a break until the early 2000s, and when that happened, I realized they were making plastic pre-painted Dungeons and Dragons miniatures. I've never used drugs in my life, but the addiction, the instant addiction to these D&D minis, it was like, oh, I couldn't get enough. And then that was around the time they Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast was releasing their D&D tiles, and it was
Oh
amazing.
yeah.
So I started collecting that, and I didn't start doing collecting any 3D terrain until about 2014, and then and it's been building slowly, a little bit here and there to become my horde, if you
Yeah.
will.
That's still quite a while collecting 3D terrain. I want to focus a
Yeah.
little bit. You mentioned you got started in the late 80s and that your brother got you into the game. What is the story of you getting into Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, I always have been a fantasy fan, and really, I think really the beginning of that was probably reading Conan the Barbarian comic books, The Savage Sword of Conan.
Nice.
And I remember when I was around 10, this is like 1981, I,
Mhm.
I saw some D&D books in my best friend's house that were his older brothers. And I remember seeing the Keep on the Borderlands adventure, the cover and the art, and I was so just fascinated because there was this elf with a bow, and he had this really cool headpiece, and he was facing down hobgoblins. I mean, I didn't know they were hobgoblins at the time. I came to find out they were hobgoblins, and but I didn't actually get to play it until I was 16. And the first day I ever played it, my mom had lung cancer, and I had moved from where I was living with her and my stepfather to where my father was living. He moved up from New Jersey so that I didn't have to go down to the schools in Newark, New Jersey, and I could stay in the same school district. And he had yet to find a home, but we were staying at a friend of his. And my brother called. It was August 10th, '87. And my mom had passed away, so my father dropped me off over at my stepdad's place, and my brother kind of ushered me through the house into his back room, and we had time to kill, and he pulled out his AD&D books. Now my brother
Nice.
had just served in the Marines for 4 years, and he actually learned to play Dungeons and Dragons while he was on float. That's when you're on a ship for 6 months
Mm-hmm.
over in the Pacific. And one of the guys he played with had played at Gen Con with Gary Gygax.
Oh, wow.
So my brother's Gygax number is 2, which makes mine 3. and and so that day, and I still have this character sheet. I rolled up this AD&D character, a human fighter named Valkar. I remember we were using the Unearthed Arcana rules, which included comeliness as a stat block. I had a 6 comeliness, and so we figured it was because I was a warrior and I had massive jagged scars across my face. So we played that day, and then that was the last time I played that character, and then he began a solo campaign for me until I found other friends who were in high school who played D&D. And that fall I really started playing D&D and just getting immersed in it, and fell in love with it. I mean, and it was definitely more interesting than my schoolwork. And so
Yes.
we had so the next town over I lived in was a place called Chatham, and there was a tragedy with this teenage boy named Wiley Gates who killed his family, and it was widely like touted that he and his best friend planned this slaughter while playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh.
So I was kind of a cut up in school, and I wasn't like a great student. I wasn't like a
Mm-hmm.
bad kid. I just wasn't a great student. And the guidance office, they never brought me in to talk to me about my feelings or anything about my mom passing. However, they found a Dungeons and Dragons book with my name in it, and they called me into the guidance office and proceeded for like 3 hours to talk to me about it and what it meant. And I had no idea. I didn't put those pieces together what they were
Uh-huh.
really doing. They wanted to make sure I wasn't a Wiley Gates, but and I'm just kind of defending it. I'm like, I'm an apologist for it. And I was like, no, it's great. I mean, like my vocabulary, my knowledge of lore and mythology, and sitting down with friends, and how great it was. And I had no idea what they were doing. And it wasn't until years later they thought that I was probably gonna like, roll one of those funny shaped dice one too many times, go bonkers, and go pull a Wiley Gates, which was completely asinine, because it's just a terrific game, and I have loved it ever since.
That is borderline insane.
Yeah.
That's wild. I have not heard a story like that.
Yeah.
And of all the people I've talked to so far, that's the closest I've heard of someone having that kind of connection. Especially
Yeah.
around that time, I feel like was that the tail end of the Satanic Panic or kind of the peak
You know what?
of that?
I probably was like later, '87. I mean, AD&D had begun its run, I believe, in like '78 or
Mm-hmm.
'79 for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I mean, they
Oh,
certainly had
okay.
some years before it to
Mm-hmm.
get some people who were crusading against it. But it was just it was love, at first sight with the
Mm-hmm.
game. That Christmas, my dad, who was not, he wasn't a man of means either, and he asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I told him I wanted some of these D&D books, and he didn't know what to get, so we went to this toy store, and then they had a basement area, and you went down, and there was the shelves with D&D books, and I picked out the Player's Handbook, Unearthed Arcana, the Monster Manual, the DM's Guide, Dragonlance Adventures, and Oriental Adventures. And so 6 books, and I think it was about like 100 after tax, $130. Wow, six
Wow.
books, that's great. and it was, yeah, it was so it was that was like still like one of the best Christmas like I ever had. Even though my mom had just passed, all those
Mm-hmm.
books, and then just the camaraderie I had with this small group of friends.
Wow.
So Yeah.
That sounds like quite an upbringing, and it sounded like your dad kind of supported your habits at that
Yeah,
young
yeah.
age, which is it's great because I know a lot of people at that time period didn't quite have that, and
Yeah.
would always become kind of a point of contention in some families.
Yeah,
Um,
I think, for my friends and I, all the parents were really good, whether we played at their dining room table or in the basement or wherever it was. There was always lots of support. And, my one friend's mother was like the riddle master. So like if we were ever stumped when a DM gave a riddle, we were like, okay, can we get help from Murph? And it was like, we'd go and we'd tell her the riddle and she'd give us the answer.
oh, nice. You
Yeah,
had to get her in your party to get her down rolling dice.
absolutely. Yep.
So, and here you are years later, still running games, and I saw you run games with your family. You run games you recently did virtual GaryCon, which was a fun looking game. Um, of all these things and years of experience now, what has been the one thing that is your most favorite, enjoyable part of the hobby?
Oh man.
Just
I
one
think
thing.
I think the collaborative improvisation that happens when you play, it's the series of events that gets triggered by, something you plan, but more likely something the players do, the
Hmm.
consequences that the players have to face for their decisions. And it could be good consequences, it can be bad consequences, but usually that something that happens that triggers this terrific role playing session and dice session and encounters, all that was unexpected. So I really think that when that happens, that's the magic. That because it's unexpected. As a dungeon master, you plan, you prepare, you have a general idea, but when things take a life of their own,
Hmm.
I spent a lot of years making independent films, and and as a writer and director, I had a vision, I saw things, but it wasn't until the collaboration came in, when the performers brought something different that I didn't see, or
Hmm.
the composer. It just or my my brother who was my cinematographer with you know with the lighting and with the composition, just so that collaborative thing that happens. And when things happen on the fly that are unexpected, it's that I love it.
So you that is, I think, one of the most commonly mentioned side of D&D is that collaborative storytelling and the unexpected. And I believe I want to say it's the Fate system, but I could be wrong. There's one of those systems where one of the rules for a game master is also, play the game and see what happens. That's part of the rule of the game. Um,
Yeah.
but you always have, or most DMs have this hurdle they have to get over where they're dealing with possibly new players who might not be so comfortable being, accepting of failure and running and doing this collaborative story. So what are some of your tricks that you use to get players to that level where they're okay with messing up and they're just ready to tell a great story?
But you know what? I I like to remind, other players that, when, maybe sometimes they have to like let the new person or the person who breaks a sweat role playing or making decisions because they're still not comfortable with it,
Mm-hmm.
they've got to make their own decisions. I like to draw them into the story. For me, that's one way to do it. I like to draw them in the story. I like to make them comfortable. I don't, and that may mean if I'm talking, if I'm on the other side of a screen and I'm trying to draw out somebody's role playing, sometimes on the other side of the screen doesn't work. So, you know, I'll really try and get into the character of the NPC, and I'll get up and I'll walk around. I'll squat down next to them. I'll sit down next to them. I'll put my arm around them. Whatever the character would do, I just so that it becomes as immersive for them, so that maybe they can kind of forget, the things that are going on in their head that are stopping them from letting go and just opening up a bit. And I don't I don't I don't make anybody feel bad if they aren't doing great. I want them to do their best. They don't have to be the best, but doing their best and just trying, I think, is great. And some of the people who struggle with role playing have been the wellspring for some of the greatest moments in the games that I've run, and I've really
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed that. So, I just think, making people aware right out of the gate. I mean, if they're new at your table, I like people to know, like, hey, you know what? There's no right way to do this, and I don't stick to the rules. I had a gal from the judo club, Jason Morris Judo Center, where I teach at, and she came and she was playing, and she wanted to do things that weren't in the rules, and
Hmm.
and it meant like she was going further. She's like, oh, I'm just gonna run over here and start climbing up, and she would not have had the actions or movement to do it. And I'm like, why am I gonna stop this moment of creativity for this first time player
Hmm.
and tell her, well, that's a great idea, but really you can only get here? How lame would that be?
Yeah.
So I'll break the rules. Are just that the rules are just the guidelines. And I mean, the dirty little secret that I think all DMs know is that you don't even need rules, right?
Yeah.
So whatever is fun, and I like to try and be aware of my players and the looks on their faces to see if they're having fun. If they're not having fun, I've got to do something. I have to change and do something different.
Hmm. That is a really good point that I think that would be really helpful for new DMs, is considering that rules aren't the most important thing all the time. So I really like that, and I appreciate you bringing that up, especially new players. It can also always be daunting putting a new player at a table with experienced players,
Yeah.
because it's like they're on two different levels of this game. Um, so changing subjects a little bit, I know you run some games for your family, and you've run some games for children, which I know can be kind of a whole other beast compared to running games for adults. How has
Yeah.
that running, whether it's for your children or your kids' friends or however, how has that affected your just game mastering style in general?
Well, I mean, kids are always trying stuff, like it doesn't matter whether they're playing a game or in life. They're always trying to creatively get around things and get away with things. So, it's good because I like being kept on my toes, but I think I apply the same method to running games for kids that I do and that I would recommend for new DMs to apply to just running games. And that, especially if you're new and you're not comfortable with the rules and players want to do stuff, say yes. Say yes, because you want them to enjoy themselves. Let them do what they want to do. You can have consequences for that. I want to do this and I want to jump over here and do this. Okay, yes. And, you know,
Mm-hmm.
so I think saying yes and remembering that, it's about fun. It's also about fun for the DM too. But I think like early on, particularly for new DMs, like say yes more often than not and break your chops that way. You'll come to the rules and how you want to apply them as you go and as you get to know your group. So I think for kids, I think it's just, you know what? Let them explore. Let them tell you what they find. You know what I mean? But I do this also with my players. They say, "Oh, I want to go talk to a street merchant." Okay, describe them for me. You
Mm-hmm.
know? Oh, it's a guy with a wooden leg that looks like it was chewed on by something, and he's missing an arm at the elbow. Okay, they've given me enough. They've introduced somebody, and now it gives me enough time to think about how I want to portray that character. But like for kids, I open a box. Oh, tell me what you find.
Mm-hmm.
What? And it gives them, and that's a good way also to help. I think young kids learn to become dungeon masters
Mm-hmm.
when they start to realize when you give them a little bit of power creatively and with the story and the elements within the story, then they will ultimately feel more comfortable when they start doing that for people themselves.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I hadn't even looked at that perspective. I'm still, personally, that idea of asking the players, "What do you see? What do you find?" I'm still trying to implement that into my games, and I'll tell
Yeah.
you that it's been crazy how much less stressful a game can be when someone wants to talk to a random NPC and you're like, okay, who do you find? What do they look like? And you're
Yeah.
no longer the one sitting there being like, oh, I got to come up with something here and I got to give them a name and I got to give them a funny voice.
Yeah.
Having that stress not in your head is amazing and a
Yeah.
great tool. What has been your favorite thing that a player has come up with?
Oh man. Um, well, improvisationally, well,
Hmm.
character wise, my brother my brother Joe, who got me into the game, loves to play dwarfs that talk like Al Pacino, so I love that. I really love that.
Nice.
I just oh, okay, here was something. I was running the Skull and Shackles campaign, the Pathfinder Adventure Path, and the like part of that system, for that particular campaign was that you gain infamy points, and the players were always like, oh, like they should know us. We're infamous, and that provided a springboard for me in some cases. I mean, I'm not a adversarial DM. I really root for the players, but I do like to make things challenging for them,
Yeah.
including the role playing aspect. So they wanted that infamy and they wanted that notoriety, but with it came things like graffiti on city walls with depicting their characters and things that affected them in another way. That infamy they wanted. It was a two-edged sword sometimes. So I think things like that. I had a character who he created this female Eladrin who was just like wickedly powerful and normally like just kicked butt and made one mistake and then ended up going unconscious, which provided a great opportunity for me. I mean, I could have just killed his character and she could have been gone, but there was no fun in that, and that was in the Eberron world. And I ended up taking her, and the Lord of Blades had her. I mean, she's been a thorn in his side, so he chopped off her hands and peeled the skin off her face and molded a iron mask on her, which ultimately got resolved, and it was like some growing pain. Like, it was kind of very frustrated with that event, but ultimately it led to something better, and it was like really like completely badass later on when she recovered herself. So I think anytime that the players just give me opportunities to dig into the story, to dig into their choices, those are the things that I really love, and I can't plan that. So the best moments have always come quickly, and I've missed them sometimes. I didn't do exactly what I wanted, but a lot of times I'm pretty fast, with the improv and able to like roll with it and make it all count for the story. And sometimes they grumble, but later on they're like, yeah, that was great for the story.
That is a really good point. Diving into the story and bringing the characters into that it's an interesting thing. It's also very challenging sometimes.
Yeah.
When are you a homebrew world person or a module person?
Well, I've done both. I absolutely love Curse of Strahd, and I ran it completely through for my Friday night group. But there were like, very core elements that were tailored to character backstory, which led me to their ultimate escape from Barovia, and I think it was Ship of Horrors. It was a 1E or 2E module to get them to the location for House on Griffin Hill, which was Ravenloft 2, which I kind of adapted on the fly for 5E. And so if it's written, I make it my own, and it's not the same experience if I ran it for somebody else, because they the players have different backstories than another group.
Mm-hmm.
But I did a homebrewed campaign in terms of like Eberron. Like we went all the way through to epic level, and it was my story, but it was that world. I love that world. It's just so interesting. And but I also have done my own worlds too. But I think the D&D settings are so rich. I don't generally do Forgotten Realms, and Forgotten Realms is just so well known and saturated.
Mm-hmm.
I have the 1E original box set, and if I think I ever ran Forgotten Realms, I would go back to that time period because there's so much not known, and but I think too many of my players know about Forgotten Realms.
Yeah.
It becomes too much because it's like, oh no, that happened. No, that happened in the canon world. This is my homeworld world. So I'd like to I like to take things. I love the 4E kind of standard generic setting of the Nentir Vale, which was really fantastic. Mm-hmm. So a lot of campaigns I may do that are homebrewed, I use that realm as a kind of the springboard for it.
Interesting. You answered my follow-up question, which was going to be, how do you get players more invested in a module, which is, you said you embed their backstories in there, but then you went off on worlds. And
Yeah.
that is something I think is interesting, and I know a lot of DMs. We get into running games, and one of the first things I think we all try is making our own world. Now, you mentioned Forgotten Realms is there, but it's very well known. But you mentioned Eberron, you mentioned Nintir Vale, these different settings. What about
Yeah.
those settings were so interesting to you? And the advice I'm looking for is for another dungeon master could look at it and say, that might be something interesting for my own world.
Okay.
So what catches your attention in a world?
So whatever edition you're playing, for example, I'm gonna go back to the 4E camp. It wasn't really a campaign setting. It was loosely used for some modules, and they had some regions in the back of the DMG for 4E for the Nintir Vale,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just a broad brush. There wasn't a lot of details. There might be some rumors about some locations, and it was really interesting because it was like, you know, a waning civilization where there were just like points of light, and everything, like all the lands in between were like, there were ruins, and it was not necessarily a friendly place.
Mm-hmm.
So I really liked that I could take that and just make it my own. Eberron is one of those campaign worlds where you have like this significant event, this arcane catastrophe that destroyed an entire nation, and this event called the Morning, and they never tell you what caused it, which is tremendous because every dungeon master can come up with their own answer. Or there are so many plot points within it and different groups. I'm not a big fan of the 5e Forgotten Realms like factions,
Mm-hmm.
but in Eberron, there are more opportunities for like intrigue and espionage. And I love the fact that there is this technology that is powered by arcane magic. So,
Mm-hmm.
things like the lightning rail is arcane train, or airships, or underwater airships, or elemental powered galleons for the sea, that you can quickly go to different environments as much as you want. And again, it's one of the and that is a particular campaign world that I enjoy because you can take just what you want. It's so robust that you can just deal with like one group of villains, and that can be your entire campaign. And
Mm-hmm.
then you could turn around and run it with a different group of villains, or even the same villains, or the same topics, just done and explored in different ways. There are so many opportunities for those worlds. So I really, when I think when the worlds are kind of broad brushed and not so finely tuned, and there aren't like 1,001 novels written
Mm-hmm.
in those campaign settings, you can take liberty. I mean, you could do that anyway. You could
Yeah.
do that with Forgotten Realms, but I just enjoy that particular campaign setting, and I enjoy the 4E one, and I encourage people. In fact, the 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 pantheon from 4E, which had a couple new gods, but then there was stuff taken from Greyhawk mythology, and it was just a really tight, nice little package of deities, and they included that in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5E, not the Player's Handbook. So you
Mm-hmm.
could always check that out. But just it's a really cool little setting, and that's the launching pad for the one home game I have. But those characters are on the moon right now because I love Flash Gordon. I wanted to like have like an episode like where they went to the moon. So
Okay.
yeah,
We'll come back to that, but I just wanted to emphasize something you said there that was interesting. Was the broad strokes. The
yeah,
broad strokes for you made those worlds interesting, and I see that as like permission. I'm taking that as permission for myself. I can do more broad stroke stuff. I don't have to dive into
yep.
all the details in the world. Because a lot of times new dungeon masters, we get into that. We get in like, oh, I have to make, I make a village. I have to make every single character in this village, and it has to
Well,
be, I need to write my 1001 novels
well,
on
that's
my
the
own
game,
world.
right? That's the Game of Thrones effect.
Yeah.
I remember like I love the books, and I remember when I picked up the first one in '99, and it was like, man, the first 100 pages I loved, but like you didn't get a grasp on the characters until you were 100 pages in. And then there's like the complex families and how
Yeah.
it's listed in the back, and there's like the massive beautiful map depicting all these areas, and everybody knows the history. Like, you know what, there are points in history like 60 years ago that like we couldn't remember, but
Mm-hmm.
like everybody in a fantasy world will remember. Do you remember when the old king's the tine on his crown broke and it was stolen? Well, that was 10,000 years ago. It was the fabled goblin of the werewolf woods that took that. like
And
every like
everyone knows.
it's too deep. So, and actually, so as I'm thinking about this, I'm creating this kind of generic cliche fantasy setting for my next campaign. I've been struggling with this. I've been thinking about that, and I'm gonna kind of take an approach that I learned from my brother, and it was like, oh, he did a map, and it was like, here's kind of a small area where you're from, and these are the little bit of things that and I'm not going to worry about mapping anything else out because what my players' choices are, what they want to do, where they want to go, and their behavior can dictate not just the course of the story, but the lay of the land. So it's
Mhm.
another great opportunity for that kind of collaborative storytelling, and I think you can. And this, you can write yourself into a corner if you detail everything, and then even if your players don't know all that, it can become so rigid in your own mind that you're like, I can't break away from that because that'll go against what I had planned and what I was thinking about and this lore I created. And then you're missing those opportunities to let things go organically and just that collaborative fun.
Yeah, that's true. So building on that, that brings the other question, the $1 million question for all DMs. When you're making a new campaign or a new setting, how do you know you have enough material? Where do you stop?
uh, I don't I don't include much, and
Okay.
I've been thinking about this, and maybe I'm a little lazy this way, and that's why I have tended to like go with Eberron or use the Nentir Vale area of the 4E setting. But so for this upcoming campaign, I just want to have a region, things that enough different locations that provide variety of encounters, riverside, lakes, sea, some mountains, some forest, that I can plug pretty much anything into that I would like that comes up. The first adventure, I'll have some hooks and things that they can run with, but for this upcoming campaign particularly, I want them to drive the events. So
Hmm.
I'll keep it very loose in terms of how it looks, and I might throw a map that has some locations that might be known, and then develop that as they explore. I think. I mean, you can go as detailed as you want. I mean, if you have fun doing that, but I think you might miss the opportunity of, I think, the true greatness of the game, the role playing game, and the collaborative storytelling nature.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's something really can be taken to heart relatively easily. Is just do a little less. Is
Yeah,
essentially we boil it down to you don't need to do so much.
yeah.
You
Less is
can
more.
do a little less and open things up. So that is some great advice. Thank you for that. That's what I was hoping you would say, but you never know. Now I have a more difficult question because you're
Uh
given some great advice on a lot of different subjects, but I want to know what is the thing you struggle with the most as a DM?
oh. Oh man. You know, I struggle with keeping it small in terms of like story. I struggle with having an adventure that can be completed in one night or two nights. It tends to get big, and sometimes I can get a little dark too quickly in the story.
Hmm.
I so I can traumatize the players too early on, and and I so it's hard for me. I think of, like, in my head, the story starts to get bigger. I'm trying to like think ahead while keeping it loose enough that things can change. But I think what happens is I don't give the players enough downtime. The campaign can start to get my campaigns can start to get pushed where it's an imperative to continue on and keep rolling until the end. When I
Hmm.
began, the before the Eberron book came out, and I did my 5e campaign in Eberron using the Unearthed Arcana for reference material for some of the races and information. Originally, they were working for a professor at Morgrave University, and basically they were just going to be treasure hunters, and he was sending
Hmm.
them out. But I knew that I wanted this thread of intrigue that was going to tie into a bigger plot. And looking back, I mean, there was a number of just like, oh, we're going to pick up this artifact and that artifact, but ultimately, the story just got pushed really a little out of control, almost not railroaded, but the story steamrolled toward the conclusion, at 18th level. But it was just with just the intrigue. They never got a break. In fact, that campaign got so nuts. This is how nuts it got because I got into like time travel, and then there were like multiple timelines, and they were going to different planes that I took a break from the campaign. I couldn't do it anymore to do Curse of Strahd. And then when we came back to it, we started playing. And as I was going into the finale, the final few episodes of the campaign, I came up and I said to my wife, I said, I need help. I have all these timelines, and we actually sat down together and had to like do like a timeline and write all these events and how they tied in. So it's kind of like the movie based on the book, The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler,
Mm-hmm.
and both the book and the movie is very convoluted. Even he admitted that, but it's so good and fun. And I think that story became convoluted. So I think sometimes my fault is that things can become convoluted in that way. It's still loads of fun. I think I tend to let intrigue creep in a little too much. So with this next campaign, I want to kind of pull it back and be a little more traditional. So my fail that's probably my biggest failing.
So when you find yourself slipping in that and going big like that, what do you do to rein yourself in?
I, well, that's the problem. Once it's done, it's done. I try and get back. I try
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not unreasonable. I don't like to make bad bad choices that I have to recant and say, hey guys, I pulled a mistake there. I had the players in my one campaign where they wanted to go and see if there was a magic shop, and so I was like, oh, my buddy Artwright and I wrote a chapter for the Nord Games book, Spectacular Settlements, and it was like this massive chapter that we wrote that was all with these interesting NPCs and their backstories, and it had to get changed a bit because it was just too big. But I had created this character who was a very needful things character, Godfrey Brimble, and he would only allow one person in the shop. He had this box, whatever your heart's desire, it was in there. And if you ask, oh well, how much do I owe you? Who am I to quibble over coppers? It's yours. So they willingly took these items that turned out to be cursed, and they were, like one person, like he was like, I feel like they knew it, and he wanted something that would allow him to see things as they were. So I gave him these spectacles that gave him true sight, for an hour once a day, but otherwise he was blind. And so they made these choices, and then they went to like the temple and they were like, they figured that, oh, just remove curse, and so it became a big deal because the priest, I had the priest say, I mean, it was like, well, I haven't seen you at devotionals. Tell me a little bit about what's going on, and turns out, as far as he was concerned, they willingly accepted these curses, so he couldn't just wave a hand. This would require something of greater consequence, and that was a downer for the players. And it was because I just wanted to introduce this NPC I wrote for that chapter, and I thought it would be fun. I didn't think they would take these curse items, but they did, and they had to face consequences. And ultimately, I had to kind of hand wave it in a way that made sense for the story. I didn't like that I had to do that, and I didn't, it was, so
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't. That was a little bit of a hiccup, but I've got a great group of players, and they love playing in the game with me as much as I love playing with them.
That's excellent. Speaking of NPCs, because you actually just reminded me, a while back we had started talking and working on this coalition box adventure.
Yes.
That similarly, it got a lot bigger than we had intended, but you had come up
Yes.
with a way and you had a method for creating NPCs, I remember. So I wanted
Yes.
to know from your advice, what are the most important things to focus on when you create a new NPC for a game?
You want the players to feel immersed in your world. You don't want them to feel like you're plucking something from thin air. If they're going to surprise you and say they want to go to a bakery, you want to like offer them several choices, and so that they're like later on like, holy cow, like that was in his world.
Mm-hmm.
That's really there, because that immersion is what part of what makes the game great. I was really fortunate. Two of my first dungeon masters were schizophrenic, not really, but they were never at a loss for words. They were never tongue tied. It was so seamless that it felt real. So I think the thing to do is think about the likely places they may go, in addition to where you may have them plan to go and visit,
Mm-hmm.
and and think about how you would want that NPC to be. Pick a voice, and you don't have to be great at a voice. Maybe you just watched an Adam Sandler movie and you want them to talk like Adam Sandler, but pick a voice that is at least in your head.
Uh-huh.
Even if you can't do a great impersonation of somebody, it at least gives you a reference to, like, as an anchor point, and give them a motivation. They're not just there to be doormats. They're there to either provide information, uh, assistance, resistance. Make them feel realistic, and don't be afraid to stop for a moment and think about it. Or, if you're uncertain, just be like, oh, you great, you want to talk to them, perfect, just give me a second, I just gotta take a bathroom break and I'll be right back. And then just go kind of collect your thoughts and think, like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what are they going to ask here? I also, when I'm writing adventures, I like to, and this is, something I remember particularly. I particularly remember it from 4E modules. They would have, like, possible questions your players will ask, and here are the answers. And so having those as kind of a reference keeps you on your toes, so you're not at a loss for words. Again, you don't have to be the best at voices. You don't have to be the best at improv. Just,
Mm-hmm.
but putting in a little bit of that effort and working at it, you will get better, and your players will appreciate it, I believe.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like the that's kind of a different perspective than I've heard lately. The idea of making your world feel full. That's something we all want, but it's kind of hard sometimes to know what to focus on. So I like that you mentioned coming up with something that makes them distinctive, and give the player some options of where they can go, what they can do, and the motivation. That's always something that's a great thing to have.
Yeah.
Um,
Everybody wants something, right?
yeah, yeah.
You know, and
Um,
it
oh, go
and
ahead.
you know what? I like to introduce, like, quirky NPCs, because I mean, a lot of people,
Hmm.
in reality are a little bit quirky and,
Oh yeah.
odd and have a characteristic. So, even doing a little bit of a gesture, maybe there's something, maybe they're always just pulling on their ear, just something. It will help you and help you remember. And, oh, here's something. Absolutely, if you're doing it completely on the fly, because I have screwed myself before. Have a notepad so you can quickly write down, okay, they talk to this guard, and write their name down, and write at least a little bit of a note, something, so that you can refer back to that. So you're not like, oh, that guy, the guard, the one
Yeah.
with the pole arm. So, again, that helps people feel like it's there's something more to it.
Hmm. That's very good advice. Um, I always struggle with notes, so I've now resorted to recording the audio of the session and going
Ooh.
back later to get the things.
Oh my goodness, that's a great
I
idea.
saw a video where Matt Mercer said that that's what he does. He goes after Critical Role, he'll go back and he'll watch it and he'll pick out notes. And I said, if he's
Man.
doing it, fine. I think I can do that.
Yeah.
Um, but note taking and being able to re-reference things it's quite a challenge. What are some tools that you use in your games? Because I know you do a very analog kind of game. You have your terrain builds. What do
Yeah.
you do to keep track of everything while you're running your games?
Well, okay. Well, one thing I try to do after each game is, and I at some point I peter out a bit, and then I have to go back, and so it's good to be consistent. Is I write a little synopsis of what happened. I call it an episode guide, and before the next game, I'll send out a little blurb. This week in the Nentir Vale campaign. This week on the episode of Lost. This is what's happening. So they can. I keep it loose because I don't know exactly what they're going to do. I may have an idea, and sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
changes. And then having that campaign history written down it allows you to get back in later and plan and tie things in, and maybe like characters you hadn't anticipated being anybody, but because of the interactions turn out to be a little more substantial, you can bring them back later. I have when I prepare, like I said, I try and have some notes about what somebody might say. I'm pretty good at improv, so if it's just general NPCs, I'm okay with running with it. But if it's somebody significant that I know they're going to really want to talk to and possibly get information from, then I definitely want to have some dialogue options written. And I like to have I love my books. I love my hard copy books, but I also will export from D&D Beyond the PDFs of the monsters, so I can just like quickly like have them on my computer and punch and shuffle them back and forth that way. So
that's an interesting tip. I've always just kept D&D Beyond open, but I also know D&D Beyond is kind of a slow loading website.
Yeah, they give you an option. Yeah, you can visit the details page on a creature, and then if you go up to your browser and export it as a PDF, then you have that option for that. And then after the adventure, I can just get rid of it.
Yeah.
Which is so I'm not cluttering up my D&D folder, but doing that and having plenty of bookmarks, so I can bookmark my monster manual too.
Mm-hmm.
To use, I'll use both. But I mean, I think the plan is, I mean, I'll lay out a lot of terrain, but it doesn't mean that the players will go there. I've had players set up massive terrain, and it only ended up being, a role-playing session, or they went somewhere else, and I have to drop something down. People ask me all the time, well, what if they don't go there? I say, I don't care. They'll go where their characters are going to go, and I just, I roll with it.
Yeah, it sounds like you just enjoy setting up the terrain. And if the players go there or not, it doesn't matter because you did what's fun for you.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a great way to look at just a lot of things when you're creating your story. Is like you're coming up with the story, and if the players get there, they get there. But if not, you've done a fun thing telling your own little story.
Yeah.
Now, Dan, I want to get. We do have a question from the audience, but I want to ask you.
Cool.
The one I warned you about was, what is your number one tip for brand new dungeon masters that they should know?
It just goes back to saying yes. I think a lot of dungeon masters get uncomfortable at first because they don't know the rules, and maybe the people they play with know the rules, and they'll be like, well, can I do this and that? And rather than lose any steam and momentum in the game, rather than slow things up, rather than, you can just say yes. And sometimes I also add to that. You know what? I don't want to look this up now. Yes. But that may change in the future, just so you know. But saying yes, engaging their level of enjoyment, just say yes. Don't let them walk over you, but say yes. Players come up with wacky, great ideas. In my early career as a DM, I didn't say yes enough. Be like, oh, I want to do this, and I'd be like, no. And they were like, oh, okay. And it's like, that's no fun. I know that as a player. I want to hear yes. I'll take the consequences. Say yes. The rules will come to you as you play. Saying yes does so much more for the story, and you're in it for the story.
Yeah, that is some great advice for new players like that, or new DMs.
Yeah.
Because, I remember when I first started, it was like, oh, I got to know all the rules. I got to know everything. And, that's definitely a struggle. So, great advice. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Here's the question we got from the audience. This will change gears. Maybe we've already answered this. Maybe we haven't. This is from Jack Grimble. He says, when would you recommend to give a relatively strong item to new players, early or late game?
All right. Well, I've made the mistake of doing the deck of many things too early.
Oh, I have too. Yes.
It really depends on your campaign and the story. I tend to be, a little stingy with powerful magic items because I think whether it's in Volo's, I think Volo's guide mentions in a little sidebar that like the monsters were developed with the idea that the players would be facing them without magic. So, if you end up having, players with a lot of magic, that's fine. Just make sure the monsters hit for max damage every time, have maximum hit points possible, and feel free to change things that way. I had somebody ask me recently about like like a potion of poison. Like, oh, when would you give that to players? And I was like, well, you know what? Considering that could really kill them pretty badly. I mean, third level, fourth level might start it. I mean, it really depends what you're giving them, and don't be afraid to come up with homebrewed items,
Mm-hmm.
items that may have a powerful effect, but maybe they can only do it once a week or once a day or once a year. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you can do whatever you want. So, but it can come back to bite you. Early on in 5e, I think it was my brother. Oh man, I forget the name of this shield, but it gives you advantage on initiative. It was, it was just a tremendous shield, and and allowed you dexterity saving throws. If you passed, you would take no damage instead of half damage. So you can really upset the balance of things. It depends on your players
Mm-hmm.
too. I think it's one of those ones where you kind of feel things out. Personally, even items that are not considered powerful, I don't like to give. Man, I'll never give another bag of holding in my life. That and dark vision, man, it's ruined it.
That's kind of surprising because I hand out, well, not like candy, but I like to make sure my parties have a bag of holding. But then I think the point I would make in this, Jack, is when you're giving players, and you can disagree if you have a different idea, Dan, that's totally fine. But my thought is always, if you give players something powerful and you see them start to abuse it, like a bag of holding, people will always be like, I'm just gonna put everything in it, and I'm just gonna throw all the stuff in there. And this is
Yeah.
where, for me, I look at the rules and I learn the rules, and this is where I would then choose to really enforce that rule rather than just saying, "Oh yeah, it's cool, you can throw it in there." For me,
Yeah.
if the bag of holding, if they're throwing everything in there, as soon as they hit the 500 pounds or the 64
Yeah.
cubic feet, that thing's gonna break. And
Yeah.
I will be unapologetic about
Consequences.
that because,
Yeah.
they're trying to abuse the consequences. Same with like an extremely powerful magic item. I will make sure that if it's cursed, that curse comes into effect. And
And not just that though. If they've got an extremely powerful magic item, I mean, how did they get it? They
yeah,
were out treasure hunting. Well, maybe there's parties coming to kill them to get the
exactly.
treasure. Man, this party, they've got a dragon orb, they've got a holy avenger. We want those things.
Yeah,
That kick in the door. You got a lull in your campaign. Something's like, there's a moment where where there's boredom. You can see the glazed expressions on your players' faces. Have the door kicked in. An anti-paladin comes in to defeat the paladin and break his holy avenger. So with those things, with those great items, with that great wealth, I mean, that attracts attention.
yeah,
So
yeah. They can't be
it could be
running around
it could,
filthy
yeah. You
rich.
know what? You can do it and then turn it into story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I like that. So there you go, Jack. Turn it into story. Give it to you when you feel like it, but don't panic.
And
I always say, don't panic.
and
You
you
can
could also have, I mean, like in literature or in mythology, right? Some heroes have these legendary items. So like you could have somebody start out with an item at a low level, and as they gain power, the item gains power.
Yeah.
And then their sword becomes as legendary as they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another thing. Ray Got DM does that with his world and his adventures all the time. That is a really great way to, start small and then build into
Yeah.
the strong weapons. Really good points there. Dan, before we finish up, I want to know, where can everyone find you online and what can they expect to see?
Oh, okay, cool. Well, I hope everybody checks me out. So I'm primarily on Instagram at inkdmage, INKDMAGE. I don't know why I left the E out for inked. I thought I was being hip or something. I really regret that. So inkdmage, no E, INKDMAGE. And I do occasionally post some things on YouTube, including, product reviews and things that people send me to get a hands on, or just things that I love. A lot of any of the things that you see on either my YouTube and particularly my Instagram are things that I love. I love sharing things that I love, whether it's a book or a meal, but this is primarily focused in the realm of D&D, role-playing games, etc.
Yeah, and that's going to be linked below. And there will also be I'll put a link to your YouTube channel because I found that earlier today. I was like, oh, he's got a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Which I saw you got some good terrain stuff, some good terrain info, which people
Yeah.
look for all the time is more terrain stuff. So be sure to go check that out, guys, and subscribe to Dan's YouTube. Subscribe to this one if you haven't already. But I feel like a lot of people here have already subscribed. Dan, I appreciate you taking the time and sitting down and talking with me. This has been really fun.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Hearing about your
great.
misadventures in in the D&D world. Viewers, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Come back tomorrow. We got another really great guest. It's John Bultana. I think that's how it's pronounced. Only Play Wizards is his Instagram handle, and he is a writing professor at UC Merced and just general nerd connoisseur,
Great dude.
I guess. I'm actually a little embarrassed. I only found out about him after I started this show. And then he turned up on my feed, and I was like, I don't know who this guy is. And then I looked into it, and I was like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to talking with him. So tomorrow, that's his show. And thank you guys for watching.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. And thank you, my man, so much for having me.
No problem.